Hello, Dr. Fox here, talking about psychological perspectives on personality. Okay, this is not necessarily my favorite area because I think there are some cultural issues, and maybe we talk about those a little bit later. So, what makes people different? This is a big question, you know. Can you depend on people to be stable in how they act and react? Um, Generally, we like to think so. Maybe some cultures are more into the idea that people can change over time. All right. So, persona from Latin for mask, um, this thing that we present to the world, is it real? Is it who we really are? Or is it just what we present? Um, okay. So, theories about personality, people have been trying to figure out how other people are going to act forever. Um, the book goes back to Hippocrates, but actually, this idea of the humors goes back at least to ancient India and the Upanishads and the Vedas, which are, probably about 1,000 years older. Um, and this idea of humors, not humor like uh, comedy, humor like it's essentially the fluids. So choleric, this is your yellow bile, melancholic is your black bile, sanguine is your blood, and phlegmatic, this is where it gets a little strange. Phlegmatic, actually, a phlegmatic person is calm, reliable, and thoughtful. You can kind of see melancholic would be anxious and unhappy. Sanguine, joyful, eager, optimistic. Choleric, passionate, ambitious. Interesting stuff. Um, so the funny thing is, you're going to see these same theories from at least, 2,000, 2,500 years ago. You're going to see them show up again, even into the 20th century and really into the present. Um, no judgment on that, but I have some other thoughts myself. Anyway, we're going to skip Gall because he's a weirdo. Immanuel Kant also used this idea of temperaments, Wundt. Uh, remember Wundt from the first psychology laboratory in 1879. Um, Wundt also used the same humors, melancholic, choleric, phlegmatic, sanguine, but he said he added these two dimensions, emotional or unemotional, and changeable or unchangeable. So we're getting a little more complex in how we're looking at it. Freud, um, I think, have also expressed that I'm not a big fan of Freud, but he did come up with the first big psychological um, theoretical model of personality. Um, Honestly, I think this one it catches some stuff. You can't discount him, and he has had an enormous influence ever since. Okay, but he says unconscious drives are what make us do what we do. The Neo Freudians, yeah, childhood experiences are important, but maybe not at all revolving around sex, more social, environmental. And we did talk um, some of these other theories already when we were talking about development and Eric Erikson, for instance. Okay, so here's Freud's model. Just a little bit of the person shows, everything else is all closed off. Now, remember, in terms of historical era, Sigmund Freud was kind of a product of the late Victorian era. And in that era, all your desires, all your sexuality had to be stuffed down. If you were a woman, for sure. If you were a man, you really weren't supposed to show a lot either. So, think 1800s Austria. It was not necessarily um, well, let's just say Freud, in so many ways, was a product of his era. All right, so the id is your primitive urges, hunger, thirst, reproduction. Superego is the largely hidden over here. The id is totally hidden. The ego, this is your interface with reality, but in collaboration with the superego, which is your conscience. Yeah. So like if you ever saw one of those old cartoons where there's a good angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other shoulder, the id is that little devil, and the little angel is the superego. And they are, according to Freud, at war. And our mental illness comes when they're enough out of harmony that they cause us to be dysfunctional. Okay, so there's another little diagram. I want it now. Superego, we must do the right thing. And then the ego is like, okay, look, we have to get through this day. We have to go to work. I can't actually murder my boss, even though I'd like to, things like this. Okay, another thing that came out of really neo Freudians, because this is a product um, most likely of Anna Freud, his daughter, not of Sigmund, are defense mechanisms. Now, these are pretty useful in understanding a lot of things about how people behave, because you've probably known somebody who's in denial about something. Um, Displacement, you can't yell at your boss, but you can yell at your spouse or your kids or something. Projection, I can't accept that I want to lie about things, so I say, no, you're the liar. Um, Rationalization, pretty obvious one there, but this is where that term comes from. We use this all the time. Oh, you're just rationalizing. Well, that's from Anna Freud and defense mechanisms. Reaction formation is a little tricky because this is where, okay, good example. There's a couple, they've been together forever. They fight a lot, but they really love each other. And when one of them has to go on a trip, they have a really big fight so that they're angry when the one person leaves. So the reaction formation is this process of being mad at that person and wanting to get rid of them when they really don't, you know? Regression being like a younger child. And you will see this actually sometimes with people, especially when they've been through um, um, terrible situations. And then sublimation, which might be you have, remember, it's Freud, so oral fixation is a possibility. So somebody who smokes might have it, the habit, because they have an oral fixation, and so they sublimate by switching over to lollipops. Okay, we talked a bit about stages already. Um, and what Freud says in terms of how this relates to personality is that people may get stuck if they don't make it successfully through these stages. I'm just going to go on though, because I think it's relevant to talk about Adler here and some other things. Freud is all over the place. I mean, you hear a lot about Freud. You don't hear necessarily as much about Adler, though this idea of an inferiority complex, people use that word all the time. Well, that comes from Adler, who was a middle child, by the way, and who said that birth order was a big thing that determined how people would be. So the oldest is like the go-getter, the leader, and the youngest is babied, and so maybe, kind of is used to being pampered and getting his way. The middle child is somewhat left out and may feel inferior. So they try to overachieve, perhaps. That comes from an inferiority complex, according to Adler. Okay, so he said that we have these societal tasks, we have to have some kind of occupation, some kind of career. We have to have friendships, and we have to have love. If we don't have those, well, problems arise. All right, Erik Erikson, we have talked in terms of developmental theory. So each stage of Erikson, rather than being about these oral, anal, phallic latency in general, it's about your relationship, trust versus mistrust, and going on. In early adulthood, according to Erikson, you have to develop your relationships, intimacy versus isolation, and then generativity in your middle adulthood, later adulthood. Are you helping the next generation get along? Okay, Carl Jung. Now, Adler and Jung, Freud kind of claimed as his students, but they really, really did not like that. What they said is that they were, colleagues. They went to the same discussion groups. In the 1880s, 1890s, there were these groups of scientists who would get together and discuss things. And in Vienna, there was a group of budding psychologists who would get together. And all three men were part of that. But they had some different ideas from Freud and were somewhat influenced either by Freud or the environment, but went very different directions. So Carl Jung, he liked the idea of the unconscious, but he said it was more like we all share that unconscious. So the collective unconscious, all humans have, and these have patterns that we enact in our lives, archetypes. So the hero, the maiden, are you somebody who has to come to the rescue? Are you somebody who wants people to come rescue you? Things like this. And the persona is the mask of this role that we try to play. Okay. He came up with, get this, have you ever heard of somebody who was an introvert or an extrovert? That's from Carl Jung. So these ideas from these guys early in psychology in the late 1800s, early 1900s, these have become mainstream things that people just talk about. Okay, say after me very carefully, Karen Horney. Karen Horney. She was somewhat sensitive about this because she did end up in the US. And Horney, she was very concerned about anxiety, unconscious anxiety. So that term unconscious is there again. But she said a few different things. So she didn't like the whole penis envy thing from Freud. Um, and she said, well, men have womb envy. They cannot create a life. Anyway, so she said children cope and relieve anxiety either by moving toward people, by affiliating, by being friends, or and then this goes into adulthood, keep in mind. So moving toward could lead to a really intense need for love. Moving against is the aggressive, assertive kind of thing. And as adults, they would lash out and maybe exploit other people, which we might see in people in the public eye. Moving away from people would be detached, and these people would maybe avoid relationships. Okay. Of course, we have to talk about behaviorists also. And a behaviorist would say we learn to behave in certain ways. And so our personality is shaped by our experiences and what is reinforced or not as we grow. And so as we experience new stuff, maybe our personality would change. Now, I kind of like this idea that people can change. Okay, Bandura, this is where we're talking about the Bobo doll. So somebody who came up with some very interesting ideas. He said, well, learning is important and our thoughts are important, our own cognition. So he has this idea of reciprocal determinism. So our cognitive processing, our behavior, and our context are interacting. And this is kind of obvious. I mean, from my perspective now, 100 years after some of these other, the Freudians and the Neo-Freudians, this is a century later now. And I got to say that, with everything that's come since then, this is making a lot more sense to me. So observational learning, we learn by watching behavior. So remember the Bobo doll, the little kid learned to knock the hell out of the Bobo doll by watching a model who enacted those behaviors. And he talks about self-efficacy, which is something um, these days well, it depends, but a lot of the standardized tests that they give kids to find out their adjustment, you know, kids in elementary school would include measures of self-efficacy. This would be part of social emotional learning, which is some school systems are in favor of that kind of thing. Some systems now find that distasteful. So we don't know. But reciprocal determinism is going to look at this behavior, situation, and cognition as constantly interacting, which is why there's arrows on both ends here. Okay, Julian Rotter, locus of control. Do you believe you can change things in your life? You know, which would be an internal locus of control. I can do things, I can change things in my life. And these people tend to perform better academically. Now, remember, academia is not everything in life. External locus of control says our lives are controlled by things outside of us. Now, this is another area where we get into some cultural difference because in Islam, you would say, inshallah, it is in God's hands. And people in cultures like that, or even the Tao in Chinese uh, worldview, uh, the Tao, you want to flow with it. You don't necessarily want to try to control it. So, and in Euro-American culture, internal locus of control tends to be associated with better mental health. In some other cultures, maybe not. Maybe external locus of control is better. Okay, Walter Mischel um, says that really what you got to understand if you want to look at personality, you gotta take the situation into account. Now, easy example of this is, do you behave the same with your parents as you do with your homies, with your friends, where you might get a little wild and crazy, you may use some naughty language. Um, uh, but people, according to Michelle, people would be consistent within situations, but maybe not across situations. Anyway, so his famous uh, study that is really interesting stuff was about the marshmallow. So you put a kid in a room and you put a plate on a table with a marshmallow on it. And you tell the child, you can have this one marshmallow if you want right now. If you can wait 10 minutes, you can have two. Now, this was an indicator of self control, which kind of, this is looking at, can the person delay gratification, things like this. And the kids who could control and wait were less likely to have problems in school and behavior. Okay, so he says people process cognitively, assess the situation, and behave in the way that they interpret that situation cognitively. All right, so Maslow, we think of Maslow mostly in terms of like now he didn't make the pyramid version of it, but uh, the hierarchy of needs, starting with um, basic survival stuff. And unfortunately, a lot of folks on Maui came face to face with this with the fires in 2023 when they lost their shelter and lost their livelihood. A whole city or a whole town worth of jobs went up in smoke, literally. So, um, Maslow says you need these things in place to be able to do better. There's some merit to it, but there are also exceptions to that rule in history. Carl Rogers, we're definitely going to see again uh, when we talk about treatment for mental health issues. So, but in terms of personality, um, he says that your personality is about self-concept, what you think and feel about yourself. And he says this splits into the ideal self and the real self. So the idea self is who you think you should be, the ideal self, whereas the real self is who you actually are. And he says your mental health is negatively affected the further apart those are. So high congruence, you have self-worth, you have a productive life, you know who you are, you're down with it. Whereas if it's incongruous, an incongruence between those two, this is where you have a person who's maladjusted. In other words, you have um, um, who you think you should be is not who you actually are. So the job, as we'll talk about later, the job of the therapist is to help the person to love themselves and to bring their ideal self in line with their actual self. Okay, biologically, we know that there's a lot of heritability in personality traits. So, leadership, obedience to authority, a sense of well being, these are all ones that have a really high ratio of, you know, what the twins would share. All right. And temperament, this is something that any mom can tell you about. Kids are either easy, they're reactive, or they're able to self regulate, and so the easy, difficult, or slow to warm up are pretty common across cultures.